You've probably seen crazy machines like this, and you know that they're related to oil and gas drilling. But what's going on with them? We're going to learn a little bit more about how they work and what they do today. Let's start with a little bit of history, of which LA and California have a really rich history in terms of oil. We first struck oil in 1876 in the hills, not too far from the Cal State Northridge campus. If you take a hike up there today, you'll see a little historical plaque, and you'll see the top of the well that still exists right now. Below the ground, it goes about 300 feet down and delivered about 30 barrels a day. Now that sounds like a lot. That would probably last you a whole year for filling up your car, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what a 21st century oil well produces. But this particular one was active for quite a while, all the way up until the 1960s. It's not the only well that was operating. In fact, I'm going to show you a picture in a moment of another spot, but first I want you to picture it. Maybe you visited Venice Beach. It's a very popular tourist location today, famous place for people to visit from all around the world. It's a gorgeous beach. But if you went back there in 1952, it looked like this. Each one of these is an individual oil well, and there were a lot of them. And Venice wasn't the only spot in California that had them. This is Long Beach. And if you look there, oil wells dotting the landscape as far as the eye can see. There were so many oil wells back then. What happened to them all? Do we still have any oil wells in California? To answer that question, you can actually use the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources Well Finder. Now go ahead and just Google that, type that into your Google bar, and you'll get an interactive map that will show you all the oil wells in the whole state of California. And I want you to look for the ones nearest to your house, and then also if you can find the nearest active well to your house. And you'll see the distinction when you get into that well finder. Pause the video and then come back here and we'll look together. I went ahead and chose the oil well nearest to Cal State Northridge's campus. Now, in fact, it's so near, it's actually on campus. If you look at a picture, here's some dorms, there's our baseball diamond, and then right about here, the map shows an oil and gas well. What's up with that? Well, you can actually go and read about each of the wells and find out that that particular well is inactive, and we'll look at it a little bit later. In fact, there are wells all over, some of which are active and some of which are inactive. And if you look at all over the LA area, this here is in the region of Hollywood up to Burbank, and some places have a lot of wells and others not so many. What's up with that? To answer that question, I need to give you a crash course in geology, and you're going to become little geologists, like this one. Our story is going to begin with the beginning of oil. How does oil form? And to answer that, we're actually going to go to a place that you may or may not expect. We're actually going to start in the ocean. So here's a picture. We're going to see a video of a snorkeler. And let's go ahead and watch as they go. So let's go beneath the water here. Ooh, and here we are. And as we swim near the surface, we see all these little dots. What are all of them? Some are a little bit green. Some of them are not. Those are all living things. Little microorganisms, plankton we call many of them, and some of them are plants, some of them are animals that eat those plants. They're very tiny, but there are a lot of them. And those are the building blocks to oil and gas. What happens is that those little critters eventually die. And when they die, they settle down to the bottom of the ocean and start accumulating. And we start building layer on top of layer. And it looks a lot like this. We have our water with the dead microorganisms, and they're mixed with some mineral grains, and they start filling up at the bottom of the ocean, producing layer on top of layer, with new layers forming as stuff settles out, and older layers are getting buried over time, so they're on the bottom. If we look at those layers, they have all those dead bodies in them, the dead microorganisms. But over time, as we're down there, we're getting buried. It's the heat of the Earth's interior is being trapped in there, and so those rock layers are heating up. And basically, our little dead bodies are going to start cooking. Just like in the oven, when you start cooking things, you start having some chemical changes that occur, and those dead bodies turn into oil and gas. So we have these layers of rock, and some of the organic material is going to turn into oil and gas that's going to be released, while the mineral grains that are left behind are going to stay at the bottom. And when they get released, oil is very light. It's not very dense. And it's going to rise up. And gas, same thing. It's going to rise upwards through those dense rocks that are left behind. And it's going to start moving upwards. As you look at this up close, you know that many rocks are made up of tiny little pieces and maybe little sand grains. There are little spaces in between those mineral grains, and the oil and gas can rise up through those little spaces on its way up to the surface. But some rocks are a little bit different. They have smaller grains that are pushed closer together. And what happens is that oil and gas goes up. At some point, it hits a spot where it can't go up any higher, and it's trapped. And that's what happens in our rock layers. Some of the layers we call them impermeable, and they act like stop signs to the oil and gas. Those layers that act like stop signs affect where we can find oil. It doesn't get all the way up to the surface. And if you wanted to drill for oil in this location, how deep would you have to go? Well, the oil and gas is going to slowly rise up until it hits that stop sign, and then start accumulating as a little pool below that. And when you wanted to put in an oil well, you'd drill down as deep as that layer where the oil and gas is accumulating, and you wouldn't have to drill any deeper. Let's look at that process in a little bit more detail. Step one is to drill a hole, which is not trivial. You start off with a drill bit that's as big as a person, and it has these diamond-tipped teeth that spin around. This is a serious job that costs a lot of money. These drill bits wear out as they are going through the layers of solid rock, and you have to take them off and put on a new one at the cost of tens of thousands of dollars a piece. So you've got a hole, but the thing is that hole, if you just look at it like this, there's pressure pushing on this hole, and if you just left it like this, the hole would collapse, and then you wouldn't be able to get your oil out. So the next thing you have to do is to drop in a long steel pipe, like these ones right here. And they go in and make it so that hole won't collapse. So now you basically have a steel straw. But it's not just any straw, it's a really, really long straw. In fact, most of the oil wells in the Los Angeles area go down about 6,000 feet deep or more. That's like 20 Statues of Liberty stacked one on top of the other, or just like 1 to 2 miles deep. That's way deeper. Most of the time we drill a drinking water well, it's maybe in the top 1,000 feet. This is really quite deep. And these layers here have kept oil and gas trapped down there, those many thousands of feet, for millions of years. And we are unleashing it and bringing it up to the surface. But getting the oil to the surface is not as easy as you might think. It's not those big gushers that you see in the movies. Those happen occasionally, but most of the time we have to suck the oil out. And that's where these pump jacks come in. They are pumps. A lot like these old-fashioned wells that you've seen in movies where you go up and down, and these bring up water in the case of the old-fashioned movies, but it's the same process. You can also think of it kind of like a bicycle pump working in reverse, whereas you pump up and down, that causes the fluid to move in one direction. In the case of our pump jacks, that direction is towards the surface. So extracting oil is a lot like trying to suck a milkshake from a sponge through a steel straw. Just like this. It's not so easy. And you can imagine you can't get very much oil from very far because the pump only has a certain amount of strength. And so when you want to suck the oil out of the ground, like we have this pool of oil here that we said was trapped, you can't just put in one pump in one place. That's only going to suck up oil from right nearby. You need to actually have a number of those pumps, and that's why we had so many of them right near each other, because you're literally trying to suck that oil through solid rock with the little tiny pore spaces in it, and it's really quite gooey stuff, and it doesn't travel very far with your pump. But nature gives us a solution, and that is that these layers are not always flat. If you've driven around and seen us on the side of the road layers that were all tilted, they might look something like this. And let's see how that changes the story. We have oil and gas rising up from our source rock down deep. It hits that stop sign layer, but now that stop sign layer is not flat. So let's take a look at some of the oil and gas that's over here on these edges. That oil wants to keep going upwards, and it rises up until it gets to the highest point in this little bended layer and accumulates in pools there. So folded rock concentrates oil in pockets. And what that means is that we don't need to use as many oil and gas wells, we don't need them in as many places. Another thing can happen to layers besides being folded. They can actually be cut by faults. And let's see how that works. So those faults can sometimes be impermeable, just like our other layers that we saw, and they can act like stop signs as well. So let's track some oil rising upwards, and now it comes up and it hits the fault, and it has to keep going along on one edge until it gets to the impermeable layer above it, and we get a pool of oil. And if we had something like this, well, if we look at on the other side of the fault, the oil and gas goes upwards, but then has to go off to the left. So this particular well here that I've shown in the picture, that's going to be a dry oil well, a lot like the oil well that happened at CSUN on the Cal State Northridge campus, where they drilled a well and didn't find any oil and abandoned it, which is why you don't see it today. It's been buried underneath there. But if you want to drill in this spot, you drill in one location right near this pocket. And next to that pocket, you wouldn't have any oil wells. So all of a sudden, we're starting to be able to explain what happened at Long Beach. When you look a little bit closer, there are not oil wells everywhere. There are some places where there are no oil wells and some places where there are a lot of them. And those are the places where oil is accumulating in these pockets based upon the underground geology, the folds and the faults that are trapping oil in certain places. Part 2 of our story returns to these pump jacks. They're kind of fun to watch. But if you view them in infrared, they get really interesting and we start revealing something different. You start seeing this plume of gas coming out. These things are leaking. And what's going on with that? Well, here's another example here. Here's a pipeline that if you view it in regular light, you see nothing interesting. But if you look closely in infrared, you're going to see this video clip here. They're actually looking at 2 different frequencies of infrared. So you're going to start seeing what it looks like, and then they're going to change the camera and you're going to see it even more pronounced. Is that here it is, a plume leaking out of this little pinprick here. And then if we look at it in the other infrared wavelength, we see it is gushing out, and you can really tell that. So we're seeing this in a lot of oil and gas infrastructure, is that it leaks. It leaks stuff that used to be miles down beneath the surface, and it's now coming up to the surface and going out into the air. So what is the stuff that's coming out? Well, first of all, probably the biggest ingredient is methane. That's natural gas. That's the main constituent in the stuff that when you turn on your stove or have in your furnace that's lit, that's methane. And that's mostly harmless to humans, and it happens to be terrible for our climate. It's a much greater greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, about 80 times worse on some time scales. So very terrible for climate, but not so bad for humans to breathe in. But what is bad are volatile organic compounds that also come up. Now these are things that are part of the oil and gas natural formation process. It's not like it's anything sinister or nasty that humans have done. They've just unleashed what was naturally trapped miles beneath the surface. And when it comes up into the air, that can intensify smog, among other things. Another contaminant that gets into the air from this natural oil and gas is benzene, and that's known as one of the most nasty carcinogens that causes cancer. Another one, formaldehyde. It's used to preserve dead animals in biology classes, but for humans it causes birth defects and not something you want to be breathing in. And then I've added a whole list of question marks because there's a whole bunch of other stuff. So what are some of the impacts of these chemicals?
So many people in this area have kids with asthma that have nosebleeds.
After I'm done with an activity, I'll be wheezing a little bit, and most of the time I'll get cramps.
It stinks. I live close to an oil well. It's like a couple feet away from my house.
We're by a church next to an oil drum, and there's a preschool right here, and even a middle school on the other side of the street, a block away, and my uncle actually lives right here.
And I really care about my family because I have a sister that has like heart problems. If it's too hot, she throws up a lot. If it's cold, like her lips turn purple, blue or something.
I suffered from heart palpitations. I had body spasms that got to the point where I couldn't walk.
These aren't normal for your community.
We could constantly create more renewable energy, so it just starts from there.
There's nothing else to do but shut it all down. Like, these oil wells shouldn't be here in the community, around schools, around churches, around residential facilities.
what we have as a natural resource should be given to us, and we shouldn't be fighting for it, and it shouldn't have been taken away from us. Today is today, but tomorrow, who knows what happened. So today, we make the difference.
Those kids are amazing standing up for this. Those kids are amazing standing up for something that they believe in, air that should be clean for them. And they're not the only ones that are affected. There are more than 500,000 people in Los Angeles that live within a quarter mile of an oil well. Here's a picture from Beverly Hills where this decorated little design here is on top of an oil well right by where this kid is playing. In Long Beach, it looks something like this, where you've got a subdivision. Right next to there, where one of the houses would be, an oil and gas well. In Wilmington, they certainly don't bother decorating them here like they do in Beverly Hills, but right behind people's houses, behind schools. Here's this beautiful old historic home, and right next to it, it's an oil well being drilled as we speak here. So what's going on with this? What can you do when you hear about these kids that can't breathe, when they have asthma? Well, the first thing is you can find out about organizations like Stand LA. This is an organization which is a community group that brings together churches, environmentalists, and just plain people. I've gone to some of their meetings, and they are amazing to see the groups of people that have come together to stand up for clean air for their communities. And so go and find out about them. Just the other day, there was this news article that said there's an oil well an oil company that's going to be opening up a series of oil wells. Now, these are wells here that are located in a community, and you might have seen this picture here from the video that we were just watching. This is the entrance to one of these oil well sites, and there are apartment buildings right across the street. Now, this set of oil wells was really having some problems. In fact, when the EPA inspector went there, the EPA inspector got sick. They shut down these wells temporarily and tried to fix them. Now, hopefully they've done that, and they're interested in reopening them. And that's okay if they've really fixed them, but we've seen how hard it is with the oil and gas infrastructure to fix all of the leaks. Oil wells leak. That's how things work. It's the oil and gas wants to rise to the surface, and it finds a way. It finds every little problem, and it usually gets out before we find those problems as humans that want to fix them. So this is an issue. This particular set of oil wells here is on the campus of Mount St. Mary's University. This is owned by the Catholic Church, and these people lease this land from the Catholic Church. They, as the Catholic Church, could indeed stop this. They could kick those tenants off, just like if you had somebody that was a tenant in your apartment building and they were selling drugs out of there, you would kick them out because they're doing something that's hurting the community. Well, the Catholic Church could be doing the same thing. But the problem is that the Catholic Church gets a lot of income from this tenant and is making a lot of money. And the Catholic Church does a lot of good things in the world, and they need money to make those good things happen. So they have this trade-off that they have to deal with, and that's hard for them. But the rest of the community doesn't like this. And there's something that we can do that's bigger and broader than just telling the Catholic Church to kick out this one oil and gas well setup that's right here on their property. We can do something that's bigger. Our city council is currently considering a plan to make a 2,500-foot setback for all oil and gas wells. That's about half a mile, so that basically any well that's within 2,500 feet of a school, a home, a hospital, or any other place where people need to breathe, they can't put that well there. They cannot operate that well, and it must close down. Now, this is a city council file, and you can go ahead and you can learn about that by clicking on this link here and find out what's going on and finding all the people who are making public comments in support of this rule that the city of Los Angeles can introduce. We're also thinking about doing this statewide in California, and we can advocate for that. There's another issue that I want to tell you about, though. After the oil is gone, you've sucked all the oil you can on there, you want to get rid of that well and not have to have anything sticking up from it. So what you do is you pour some cement down. So let's bring in a cement truck here and dump in some cement and fill it up. And I've done this kind of intentionally here. I've only put cement in a small section of things, and that's actually how it usually works in many of these oil and gas wells. In fact, the well that was plugged from 1954 at CSUN, which I said was a dry well, they put in cement plugs. It's a 7,000-foot well, and they put in cement plugs at two places. One down here at 1,718 to 1,765 feet, and one in the top 25 feet. These are, there are two ways you can see this. On the one hand, cement 50 feet thick is really thick. On the other hand, it's a tiny fraction of the well. And then there's another thing to think about. Was cement back in 1954 as good as cement technology today? And then the most important one. I don't know about you, but if you've walked around anywhere and you've looked at something that's made out of cement, what do you notice when you look at that stuff? It's got cracks in it. It develops cracks over time. And here now, 60 years after that well was filled and abandoned and had cement poured in, is it cracked? In some cases, those wells are going to leak. And little bits of oil and gas that the companies didn't suck out are slowly going to drift out and into the community through the cracks. And that's a problem. So there's another one here that's just outside of Northridge Park. This was abandoned in 1927, and if you look at the well logs that are available online, it's amazing we have access to all this data. They kept really good records from 1927, but one of the things that you read about this is that they did not use any cement at all back then. They just basically, it says here, it's filled in with surface formation, which is otherwise known as dirt. They basically poured a bunch of dirt into that well, and that's how that well is capped. And that's where I take my kids, is to that park. Is that a safe well? Well, sometimes you can clog it up with enough dirt and it will be fine, and in other cases, it won't be. How do you tell which ones are the ones that we have to worry about, that are in our communities, that are where we take our kids to play, and the ones that make a difference and are going to leak? Many wells have not been abandoned properly, and we have, for example, in this one here, across the street from Pacoima Hospital, here all records pertaining to abandonment are missing. And here's an example here. The site was visited by G.W. Stark in 1977. There was no indication that the well had been drilled. The site is now covered by a housing tract. We know that well was drilled because you can see that they found a little bit of gas at 200 feet and 1,070 feet. So we know it was drilled, but it's now got a housing development on top of it. Has that one been abandoned properly? We've got no records about it. What should we do? Well, you could call your legislature and ask them to reintroduce something like AB 3146, which was designed to go around and inventory the wells that we have and figure out whether they're leaking, which ones are possible problems, and that gives us a database from which we can figure out what's going on and where we need to put some money into fixing them so that they're not leaking into our community today, long after they've been abandoned and we've forgotten about them. It seems like this common sense measure, AB 3146, to take an inventory of what we've got and figure out where the problems are, that would make sense. But it died in the last legislative cycle. And let's think about why that would be. If we look at the well here that was drilled at CSUN, you can see that it was drilled by a company called Seaboard Oil Company. Now that got bought out by another company, that got bought out by another company, that bought out by another company, until finally it's currently owned by Chevron. So if this well were to leak, who would be liable for fixing it? Well, that would be Chevron. And so who would be opposed to taking an inventory and making sure that we figure out where all the wells all over the state of California and figuring out which ones might be leaking and need to be remediated? Well, that could very well be Chevron as well. The AB 3146 figured out where the problems were. It didn't allocate any money to fixing them, and who's going to be liable are the people that actually own those wells, even if they've been long abandoned and we're never even giving them any oil in the first place. But that is part of the obligation when you drill a well, is that you must pay to clean it up. So that's something else. This is one of the reasons why we don't want to be drilling a lot of wells in people's neighborhoods in the first place, because of these potential problems. I'm hoping that this little tour of how oil and gas forms and where it forms and how we get it out gives you a little bit more insight into how that oil and gas affects us at the surface when it's drilled, and all the different things that we can do to help minimize the impact on our communities by getting it out of our city.